All right. Good afternoon, everybody. So, we have come to the Civil War. And so today I'm going to talk about the meaning of the Civil War. I'm going to talk mostly about, not so much about the battles per se, but mostly about how the war changed the United States. And so we're going to start off by looking at the question of what caused the Civil War. Obviously, there was a geographical divide that developed in the United States that we can label as sectionalism. But what originally differentiated the North from the South? How did their differences become sources of tension? What part was played by cultural disparities, by economic rivalry, by ideological disagreement? Above all, what was the role of slavery in producing sectional conflict? So, explaining the uncontrolled growth of this sectional conflict during the 1850s has been one of the major problems of American historical scholarship. One school of thought regards the presence of slavery in the South and the absence of slavery in the North as the essence of the sectional controversy. Other historians have tried to argue that that this is too simplistic, and it offered alternative explanations. So some people have argued that it was a clash of profoundly dissimilar cultures. The South was rural, agrarian, conservative, very decentralized, and less economically developed. The North and the West were becoming industrial. They were modern societies. They were egalitarian. They were highly organized. And the difference in values became so great that the North and the South had become these distinct cultures. However, this approach exaggerates a lot of the points of diversity between the North and the South and tends to kind of minimize the similarities between these sections. It leaves out the commonalities, the shared values that they both had. So some have argued that it wasn't so much a clash of different cultures, but more a clash of industrial versus agrarian economic interests. The two regions had very dissimilar economies, and so they developed different economic objectives, which led to conflicts over politics. The Southern economy tended to, as we have seen, oppose protective tariffs. They tended to oppose the federal government funding internal improvements. They tended to oppose federal control of the banking system. And the North and the West tended to support these things. The crisis was caused because, according to this sort of economic viewpoint, because the North was growing at a more rapid rate than the South. It was becoming larger in population and in wealth and in productivity, and the result was the North was gaining in political power and representation. The South feared that it would be overpowered. And westward expansion prompts this race to dominate new regions and create states that upset the balance between these two sections. The flaw in this explanation is that we can point to lots of examples in history where economic diversities and conflicts exist without producing this kind of acute sectionalism that we see beginning before the Civil War. Both of these alternative explanations agree in minimizing slavery as a cause of sectional division. There is tangible evidence that people in the North did profoundly differ from those in the South over attitudes toward slavery, if not necessarily attitudes toward race. And this difference had been increasing ever since the beginning of the 19th century. During the colonial period, there was very little differences between the sections in their opinions about the morality of slavery. The Revolutionary War and the ideals of liberty and equality and the rights of man. During this period, both the North and the South had been united in condemning slavery as a moral evil. We see in the upper South a lot more voluntary manumission of slaves. We see before, sort of the 1830s or 1840s, there are some societies for emancipation and colonization in the South for a whole generation after the Revolution. We see Southern and Northern lawmakers coming together to vote to abolish the importation of slaves in 1808. And we see slavery being barred from the old Northwest, the states of Illinois and Wisconsin and Indiana, by the Ordinance of 1787. But as a cotton economy, with its insatiable demand for enslaved labor, becomes entrenched in the South, and as the center of the population begins to shift from the upper South to the deep South, this reactionary sort of thing sort of sets in. So by 1832, any kind of Southern anti-slavery movement has now vanished. The South begins to formulate this doctrine that slavery is permanent, that it is morally right, that it is socially desirable. As the abolitionist movement in the North grows, the South becomes increasingly defensive. And meanwhile, the states in the North have by this time abolished slavery. So the 1830s, we see this rise of the abolition movement that makes the issue of slavery, and it arouses widespread public sentiment against it. And it is increasingly clear that slavery is not going to go extinct on its own, that the issue will not take care of itself. And many sense that slavery was a giant contradiction to the basic American values of equality and freedom, and not only to American values, but to Christian ideas about the brotherhood of man. So we have kind of three explanations here: the cultural, the economic, the ideological. They all reflect the same fundamental force at work in society. And that was, of course, slavery. Slavery is basic to the cultural divergence between the North and the South because it is inextricably fused into key elements of Southern life: the plantation system, the social and political power of the plantation owning class, the authoritarian system of social control that develops in the South. Slavery, of course, also constituted a vast economic interest. It is intimately intertwined with the Southern economy and the American economy as a whole. And slavery presented an inescapable ethical question, which created a conflict of values, an ideological conflict. Slavery had this effect, which no other sectional factor had, in isolating the North and the South from each other. And as they became isolated, each side started reacting to this distorted mental image of the other. The North came increasingly to view the South as this world of lascivious and sadistic slave drivers. The South saw the North as a world of corrupt Yankee traitors and rabid abolitionists plotting slave insurrections. And so they start to view each other as, enemies, basically. And this process of substituting stereotypes for realities caused both sides to lose sight of how alike they are and how many values they shared. And it caused ordinary, resolvable disputes over all kinds of issues to be converted into monumental questions of principle. And once the question of acquiring land from Mexico was raised, this threat could no longer be evaded. The slavery question becomes a sectional question. The sectional question becomes a slavery question. Both of these things become this question over what's going to happen with this territory in the West. So it really is slavery as the main cause of the Civil War. Now, obviously, there is no way that I can adequately cover everything there is to know about the Civil War in a single lecture. This is a vast topic about which thousands of history books have been written, and they look at the war from every possible angle. I'm going to try to cover some of the major highlights, and so to a certain extent, we're going to be glossing over a lot of the war itself here, but hopefully we will get a sense of the highlights and the larger significance of the war. Some historians have called the Civil War the Second American Revolution, and this is somewhat of an apt comparison because not only did the war have profound effects upon American society and politics and economics and culture, but it really is kind of the central defining aspect of our national history. It's the fulcrum around which everything that comes after the war turns. So the big question is, how does the Civil War change the United States? The American Civil War is often called the first modern war. We have mass armies confronting each other on the battlefield with deadly weapons that were created by the Industrial Revolution. Prior to the Civil War, warfare had been fairly limited. It was largely a matter of small professional armies facing off against each other with pre-modern weaponry. The Civil War may have begun as a battle of army versus army, but it becomes a conflict of society versus society. And the distinction in a war like this, which is one of the reasons why they call it a first modern war, the distinction between military and civilian targets often disappeared. So in a war like this, a lot of things matter just beyond individual battles. The effectiveness of political leadership on either side, the ability of either side to mobilize economic resources, the society's willingness to keep fighting. These things are as crucial to the outcome as success or failure on individual battlefields. No one, not the soldiers, not the officers, not the American public, was prepared for the way that technology had transformed warfare. The Civil War was the first major conflict in which the railroad was used to transport troops and supplies. It was the first to see railroad junctions become very crucial military objectives. It saw the first demonstration of armored naval warfare in the battle between the Union Monitor and the Confederate Merrimack in 1862. The war saw the first use of the telegraph for military communication, the introduction of aerial surveillance in the form of observation balloons, and even primitive hand grenades and submarines. This revolution in arms manufacturing that had happened prior to the Civil War has now replaced the traditional musket, which is accurate only at a very short range, with the more modern rifle, which is deadly at much greater distances because of its grooved or rifled barrel. So this really changed the nature of combat in the Civil War. It was no longer where you could have armies marching towards each other, facing off squarely against each other on the battlefield. Now you needed heavy fortifications, you needed elaborate trenches, and that gave those on the defensive, in this case the Confederates, a significant advantage over their attacking forces. So we tend to think of the First World War from 1914 to 1918 as kind of when we think of trench warfare, we tend to think of the First World War. But in reality, it first becomes used in at least a limited scale during the Civil War. And this is really what produced the appalling casualties of the Civil War. Most of the recent estimates put the total of deaths at about 750,000 men. And that's an equivalent in terms of today's population of the United States of more than 7 million. The death toll in the Civil War exceeds the total number of Americans who have been killed in all of the nation's other wars, from the American Revolution to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. A lot of this was because medical care remained exceedingly primitive. Diseases like measles and dysentery and malaria and typhus killed more men than combat did. The Civil War was also the first war in which large numbers of Americans were captured by the enemy and who were held in really appalling conditions in military prisons. Around 50,000 men died in these prisons. They were victims of starvation and disease, including 13,000 Union soldiers at the notorious Andersonville prison. The outbreak of war in 1861 found both sides completely unprepared. There was no national railroad gauge, which sort of determined the distance separating two rails. So that meant trains that were built to run on one line could not run on another. There was no national banking system at this point. There was no tax system capable of raising funds needed to finance the war. There weren't even accurate maps of the southern states. For example, pretty soon after the firing on Fort Sumter, Lincoln ordered a naval blockade of the South, but the southern coastline was 3,500 miles long, and the Union Navy had 90 ships to patrol that entire coastline. So it was completely impossible. The problem of purchasing and distributing food and weapons and supplies required by soldiers, this was not something somebody had thought about before the war came. They hadn't really prepared. And as we're going to see, eventually the Union Army would become the best fed, the best supplied military force in history, while Southern armies suffered from acute shortages by the middle of the war. The efforts to mobilize the resources of the Union end up transforming the North and transforming the power of the federal government. Unlike the South, that suffered economic devastation because of the war, the North experienced the war as a time of economic prosperity. Wartime inflation, government contracts caused the profits of industry to boom during the war. A lot of industries became increasingly mechanized to supply the increasing needs of the army. Agriculture also flourished, and we see the frontier starting to push westward. We see machinery and immigrants replacing the labor of farmers' sons who go and join the army by the hundreds of thousands. So we see a new American nation state emerging during the Civil War that is committed to rapid economic development. Congress begins to adopt policies that promoted economic growth and that permanently changed the national government and the nation's financial system. The Homestead Act, for example, takes effect on January 1st, 1863, the same day as the Emancipation Proclamation. And the Homestead Act was crucial. It offered 160 acres of free public land to settlers in the West. That is going to have a transformative effect during the war, but especially after the war. The Morrill Land Grant College Act assisted states in establishing agricultural and mechanical colleges. So now the federal government is promoting higher education. There are huge grants of money and land to make internal improvements. 100 million acres were given to the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, which are chartered in 1862 to build the Transcontinental Railroad. To pay for the war, the government begins increasing tariffs, and also that is intended to promote the growth of northern industry, also imposing new taxes on the production and consumption of goods. We also see the nation's first income tax passed during the Civil War. The country borrows more than $2 billion by selling interest-bearing bonds and creating this immense national debt. And the nation prints more than $400 million in paper money called greenbacks. The North establishes a system of nationally chartered banks. And these banks were required to purchase government bonds, and they were given the right to issue government banknotes as currency. So a lot of Americans end up creating or consolidating their fortunes during the Civil War. Men like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, Jay Gould, J.P. Morgan, these captains of industry that are going to completely transform Northern society, and especially after the war, are going to become very, very wealthy. They are able to escape having to go into the military service because they are able to purchase exemptions or hire substitutes. This is allowed by the law that was passed establishing the national draft. So what we see is a vast increase in the size and the power of the federal government. The federal budget for 1865 was more than $1 billion. It was 20 times higher than it had been in 1860. the government becomes the nation's largest employer as well. And even though a lot of this was temporary because of the war, we're going to see how the government is never going to return to the condition that it had been in the pre-war era, this weak, sort of fragmented, piecemeal kind of government. It's really a transformation in the power of the government because of the war. So the North transforms economically, politically. What about the South? Uh, the Confederacy suffered from another number of problems. Jefferson Davis was not a very effective or inspiring leader. He was unable to rally public support for the Confederacy. He didn't have Lincoln's political ability, his flexibility, his ability to communicate the meaning of the war to ordinary citizens. Under Davis, the Confederacy became much more centralized than the old South had been. The Confederate government was able to raise armies from scratch. They took control of the Southern railroads. They built manufacturing plants. But they could not find an effective way of utilizing the South's major economic resource, which was cotton. Cotton, not a terribly good sort of thing to use if that's your only resource in during fighting a war. Early on in the war, the government actually tried to suppress cotton production and urged planters to grow food instead. They actually banned cotton exports. And they were sort of hoping through this to not only make the South economically self-sufficient, but also they were hoping that this suppression of cotton production would actually cause Great Britain or force Great Britain to intervene on the side of the Confederacy. Because, of course, Great Britain is the country that's buying most of the South's cotton at this point. This cotton diplomacy turned out to be very ineffective, and it had far-reaching global consequences because realizing that they were over-dependent on Southern cotton, countries like Great Britain moved to expand their cotton production in other areas. Britain promoted the cultivation of cotton in places like Egypt and India, the colonies that they had there. And as a result, once cotton production resumes after the war, this leads to a worldwide crisis of overproduction that ends up driving down the price of cotton and impoverishing cotton farmers all around the world. So it's not a terribly effective, policy. We also see that there's a lot of social change and inner turmoil that engulfed the Confederacy. At the beginning, most white Southerners tended to rally to the Confederate cause, and they talked about it using the language of freedom. One volunteer wrote, apparently oblivious to this hypocrisy, "We are fighting for our liberty against the tyrants of the North who are determined to destroy slavery." The South became increasingly divided over a whole number of issues. Mainly the draft. Like the Union, the Confederacy allowed individuals to provide substitutes, so you could get out of being drafted if you could, pay somebody to go in your stead. Because slavery was starting to disintegrate, the Confederacy, though, exempted one white male for every 20 enslaved people on a plantation. And that released a lot of overseers and the sons of plantation owners from having to go into military service. It was felt they needed to be back on the plantation to try to keep the enslaved people there. This had the effect of alienating a lot of non-slave owning whites. And so a lot of people became convinced that this was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. There was also economic deprivation that sparked a lot of disaffection with the Confederacy. As the Northern blockade became tighter, a lot of areas of the Confederacy started to become under Union occupation as production by enslaved people started to decline. You start to see shortages of essential commodities. And the war left countless farms and plantations and businesses in ruins. This economic crisis was in some ways unavoidable, but the Confederate policies actually made it worse. Warfare, of course, requires a certain amount of sacrifice on the part of the civilian population. And the civilian support for the war tends to depend upon the belief that that sacrifice is being fairly shared. A lot of non slave owners, though, and remember that's a majority of the Southern white population, became convinced that they are bearing an unfair share of the war's burdens. The Confederacy had to borrow heavily to finance the war. Unlike the Union, however, the plantation owning dominated Confederate legislature was not willing to put heavy taxes on wealthy plantation owners. So they basically relied on printing paper money. They issued about a $1.5 billion of Confederate greenbacks, much more than the North printed. And they also authorized Confederate military officers to seize farm goods to supply the Confederate Army. And they paid these farmers in these increasingly worthless Confederate money. So small farmers deeply, deeply resented this. And we see food riots breaking out in many places. By the end of the war, desertion is also a real problem. More than 100,000 Confederate soldiers had deserted by the war's end, and almost entirely these were poor, non-slave owning white soldiers. By 1864, there were some organized peace movements that had appeared in several southern states, and there were some secret pro-union societies that were actively promoting sort of this disaffection with the war. This growing shortage of manpower eventually leads Confederate authorities to think about authorizing arming enslaved people to fight for the South. Most of the enslavers fiercely resisted this idea. It was initially rejected by the Confederate Senate. It wasn't really until March of 1865, which is just a month before the end of the war, that they actually authorized this. So the war is over before the recruitment of black soldiers actually began. The Confederate Army did actually employ many blacks, but nearly all of them were enslaved people, and they were employed as laborers. They were not fighters. They were not soldiers. And so this later led to confusion over whether black people actually fought for the Confederacy. Apart from maybe a handful who kind of quote unquote passed for white, no black people actually fought for the Confederacy. The decision by the Confederacy to raise black troops illustrated how the war undermined not just slavery, but also the pro-slavery ideology that had dominated the South prior to the war. One Georgia planter and politician put it this way. He said, "If slaves make good soldiers, our whole theory of slavery is wrong." And of course, that would be, sort of what was proven. The war ends up changing the lives of American women as well. For women in the North, the conflict opened up new doors of opportunity. Women took advantage of the wartime labor shortage to move into jobs in factories and into certain largely male professions, particularly nursing. Nursing was something that had been mainly done by men prior to the Civil War, but during the war, women kind of become nurses. Jobs as clerks in government offices as well are taken up by women. A lot of these wartime gains ended up being short-lived, but we do see in some jobs women finding kind of a permanent place within the workforce. Hundreds of thousands of Northern women also joined organizations that gathered money and supplies for the soldiers, sending books and clothing and food to soldiers and also to the freedmen in the South. The U.S. Sanitary Commission became kind of the centralized national relief agency to coordinate these donations on the Northern home front. It was men who controlled the Sanitary Commission at the national level, but it was women who did most of the grassroots work. And women played a leading role in organizing basically these bazaars, these grand fairs that displayed military banners and uniforms and other relics of the war and sold goods to raise money for soldiers' aid. So these acts of volunteering for the war effort end up bringing a lot of Northern women into the public sphere and giving them kind of a taste of independence. And a lot of the leaders of the post-war movement for women's rights comes out of this wartime mobilization effort. For example, Clara Barton, who was able to organize supply lines and nurse wounded soldiers during the war. After the war, she becomes one of the leading advocates of women's suffrage, and she becomes the president of the American National Red Cross. In terms of women in the Confederacy, they were directly affected by the war more than women in the North were. The war put unprecedented burdens upon Southern white women. Many of them were left alone on their farms and plantations, having to manage the business affairs, having to manage the enslaved population, which had previously been pretty much exclusively the responsibility of men. Women in the South, as in the North, mobilized to support soldiers, and they began to step outside their traditional quote unquote sphere to run businesses, to work in arms factories, to work for the Confederate government. The war leads to the political mobilization of non-slave owning white women in the South. They petitioned their Confederate government for assistance, and they began to, become growingly disaffected from the war. So we start to see kind of a large-scale contributing to the decline in civilian morale and encouraging the desertion from the army. We see sort of Southern women playing a huge role in that. Now, of course, the big change that we see coming out of the war is the abolition of slavery. So how does this happen? So there were this was a question where there were a number of different possibilities that slavery could have been abolished. So there are several ways that this could have happened. The first way was, of course, by individual manumission. That is, enslavers could have decided to free their slaves themselves, and some did. But this method was not sufficient. Because it was never practiced in large enough numbers to actually threaten the system or the institution of slavery in the South. There was also the possibility of legal emancipation, that is, slavery being abolished at the state level by individual states. And of course, this was something that happened in the northern states after the American Revolution. But in the South, this method would not have worked because legal emancipation would work in a society, like in states in the North, where slavery was just a single element of the social and economic order, but not necessarily its foundation. And it would only happen in a society where enslavers did not have the political power to prevent the legislature from passing legal emancipation. And this was simply not the case in the South. It was an enslaving society where slavery was the basis for the society and the economy, and where enslavers held all the political and economic power. So there's a third option as well, military emancipation. So that is warfare, destabilizing society, and allowing enslaved people to run away and seek their freedom, and encouraging the opposing side to target slavery to weaken your opponents. This had happened before during the American Revolution and also during the War of 1812. Enslaved people were promised their freedom by the British, and a lot of people took the British up on that offer. But again, this method would not have been sufficient, and it's for the same reason as number two. It doesn't destroy the institution, and many of those who sought the freedom during these previous wars end up being re-enslaved once the war is over. So abolishing slavery really required some kind of constitutional amendment, a form of legal emancipation, but on the national level, to destroy the institution and the system of slavery. So what was Lincoln's initial plan to end slavery? He was in favor, at least at the beginning of the war, for gradual compensated emancipation coupled with colonization. he wanted to make, he thought it was crucial to make enslavers partners in abolition. Lincoln initially insisted that slavery was irrelevant to the war. Early on in the war, his biggest concerns were to try to keep the border enslaving states, the states of Delaware and Maryland and Kentucky and Missouri, within the Union. And he needed to build up a broad base of support in the North for this war effort. He feared that taking action against slavery would drive these border states with their substantial population into the Confederacy, and it would also alienate conservative Northerners. So, what actually prompts him to move toward total abolition of slavery? Of course, this is the most dramatic change that the Civil War produces. The destruction of slavery, the central institution of Southern society. If we look at it in terms of global history, the American emancipation, the American destruction of slavery is greater in numbers, in scale, and in economic power than any other country in the world that had slavery. So it really was this sort of monumental thing. In the early days of the war, Congress adopted a resolution proposed by a senator from Kentucky affirming that the Union had no intention of interfering with slavery. Northern military commanders, when they encountered fugitive enslaved people, they sent them back to their owners. This was a policy that was vehemently opposed by the abolition movement. But as the Confederacy started to put enslaved people to work as military laborers, and as enslaved people began to escape to the Union lines, this policy of trying to ignore slavery began to unravel. By the end of 1861, the Union Army had adopted a plan of treating fugitives from slavery as contraband, basically property of military value subject to confiscation. And it was actually enslaved people themselves that took direct action to help propel reluctant white Americans down the road toward emancipation. Black people in both the North and the South had started calling the Civil War the Freedom War. So they are the ones to first suggest that this is a war to end slavery. And enslaved people by the thousands headed for Union lines. Including large numbers of women and children. Entire families abandoned plantations and left to go to the Union Army. Many passed along military intelligence and knowledge of the terrain in the South. In some places, the arrival of the Union Army led enslaved people to sack plantation houses, to refuse to work unless they were paid. So it really is enslaved people who took this direct action, who took matters into their own hands to emancipate themselves. Abolitionists and anti-slavery members of Congress, known as radical Republicans, quickly concluded that slavery had to be a target of the Union war effort. And as Congress became frustrated by the initial lack of Union military success, their arguments won increasing support. In March of 1862, Congress actually passed a law prohibiting the Army from returning fugitive slaves. They abolished slavery in the District of Columbia and in the territories. The Second Confiscation Act liberated enslaved people of disloyal owners in Union-occupied territory, as well as enslaved people who escaped to Union lines. So we are seeing sort of gradual steps toward emancipation here. Lincoln himself is still trying during this period to pacify the border states and to keep them within the Union. So in August of 1861, when John C. Fremont, the commander of the Union forces in Missouri, orders the freedom of Missouri's enslaved people, Lincoln quickly rescinds that order. Later that same year, Lincoln proposes that border states begin a program of gradual emancipation, with the federal government compensating owners for the loss of their quote-unquote property. And he starts to sort of revive the idea of colonization. But it's sometime during the summer of 1862 that Lincoln concludes that emancipation is a political and military necessity. He is frustrated with the lack of military success of the Union Army up to this point. There's some hope that maybe the freedmen could help with the manpower needs of the Union. We're seeing kind of Northern public opinion starting to shift as well. And there's a calculation that making slavery a target in the war would be one of the things that would help prevent the British from recognizing the Confederacy and helping them. So, on the advice of his Secretary of State, William H. Seward, Lincoln delays his announcement that he's going to kind of emancipate the slaves until after a Union victory. And he gets that victory in September of 1862 at the Battle of Antietam. 5 days later, Lincoln issues the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. He warns that unless the South lays down its arms by the end of the year, he will decree slavery to be abolished. And he's using his powers as commander-in-chief here, his war powers under the Constitution. So the Emancipation Proclamation is a military order. If you've ever read it or if you look at it, there is no soaring rhetoric in it about the rights of man or, sort of freedom or anything like that. It's only at the very end of the Emancipation Proclamation that Lincoln says this act is, quote, believed to be an act of justice. This is the only moral language in the Emancipation Proclamation at all. Lincoln is trying to ensure that this is going to hold up in court. He doesn't want to have to deal with a lot of litigation, so he uses his war powers to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. The initial reaction in the North to the Emancipation Proclamation is not terribly encouraging. In the fall elections in 1862, the Democratic Party makes opposing emancipation the whole centerpiece of their campaign. Republicans end up losing seats in Congress. So this is not, at least initially, a very popular thing. The Emancipation Proclamation is one of the most misunderstood documents in American history. If you think that Lincoln freed all enslaved people with the stroke of his pen, that's not true. There were about 4 million enslaved people in America at that time. The Emancipation Proclamation does not apply to the border states because they are in the Union. So the Emancipation Proclamation is exclusively directed at the Confederacy, which, of course, at this point has declared itself a separate nation and Lincoln has no direct control over. About 500,000 enslaved people were living in the border states that are still within the Union, so they were not freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. Moreover, there were lots of parts of the South that at this point were also exempt from the Emancipation Proclamation. It doesn't apply to Missouri and Kentucky, Maryland and Delaware, which are states remaining in the Union. It doesn't apply to West Virginia, which had also broken away from Virginia at this point and was being admitted to the Union as a free state. It also doesn't apply to Tennessee. Tennessee had already been conquered by Union troops at this point. And southern Louisiana is also exempt. These were all areas that were under Union control at this time. And there were maybe about 200,000 enslaved people living in these areas. So maybe around 700,000 enslaved people were not covered by the Emancipation Proclamation. But 3.2 million people are declared free. It's the largest emancipation in world history on a single day. Now, of course, Lincoln is only declaring enslaved people free in areas where he cannot enforce the Emancipation Proclamation. These are areas outside the jurisdiction of the Union. However, it's not fair to say that it doesn't free anybody immediately. It does apply to some areas that were under Union control. There were sea islands off the coast of South Carolina, for example, that did the enslaved people there were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. But all over the country, Black people, of course, recognized this for what it was, and they saw this as a day of jubilee. They realized that the Emancipation Proclamation meant the death knell of slavery. Now, of course, the Emancipation Proclamation frees individuals, but it does not abolish the institution of slavery. The laws allowing slavery are still on the books. This is why, as I'm going to talk about in a minute, the 13th Amendment becomes necessary. And of course, it actually required a Union victory to be implemented. It made the Army an agent of emancipation. If the Confederacy had won the war, slavery would have endured, and the Emancipation Proclamation would not have had any importance at all. But it differs completely from Lincoln's previous policies. It is immediate. There is no compensation for enslavers. There is no talk of colonization. And there's this new plan of emancipation now. It's not a gradual plan. There's no colonization, there's no compensation. They're not considering any of these efforts to try to get enslavers to agree. They're not considering that anymore. Lincoln's just doing it by fiat. So the largest concentration of property in the United States is suddenly liquidated with no compensation whatsoever. And Lincoln, in the Emancipation Proclamation, addresses the freed people directly. He says he urges them to refrain from violence except in necessary self-defense. He says he urges them to go to work for quote unquote reasonable wages. So he is treating enslaved people who had previously had absolutely no control over their lives as now free people with their own will who are going to have to start making decisions for themselves. So the Emancipation Proclamation fundamentally changes the character of the Civil War. It joins the aim of emancipation to the aim of union. It meant that if the North won, slavery was going to come to an end. Karl Marx, and I'm talking about the Karl Marx who wrote the Communist Manifesto, he at this point is writing for the New York Tribune from his home in London. And he said at the time that the Emancipation Proclamation made the war a revolution. It's a destruction of the ruling class in the South. It's a change in the nature of social relations in the South. So if we go back to where we talked about the American Revolution and kind of the definitions of what makes a revolution, it certainly is a fundamental change. And it opens up all kinds of other questions. What does freedom mean? What does equality mean? How do we have a biracial society? All of these questions are going to not be answered by the Emancipation Proclamation, but they are going to be questions that the nation wrestles with after the Civil War. One of the big things that the Emancipation Proclamation does is that it authorizes the enrollment of Black men in the Union Army. By the end of the war, more than 200,000 Black men served in the Union Army and the Navy. A third of these men died in battle or of wounds or of disease. Some of the units won considerable renown. Of course, the most famous is the 54th Massachusetts Volunteers, this company of free Blacks from throughout the North, commanded by Robert Gould Shaw, who was a young reformer from a prominent Boston family. If you've ever seen the movie Glory, that's the subject of the film. And the bravery of the 54th in the July 1863 attack on Fort Wagner in South Carolina, where nearly half of the unit, including their commander Shaw, ends up perishing, helps to dispel widespread doubts about Black soldiers' fitness to fight. Most of the Black soldiers who served in the Union Army and Navy were emancipated slaves who had joined the Army in the South. And for the Black soldiers, military service was a very liberating experience. Many of the leaders during the Reconstruction era come out of their military service during the Civil War. Within the Army, of course, Black soldiers served in segregated units under white officers who were sometimes abusive. They got very unequal treatment. Initially, they received lower pay. And they were not allowed to rise to become commissioned officers until the very end of the war. But thanks in part to the military service of these thousands of Black men, many Republicans in the later years of the war come to believe that emancipation also has to bring equal protection of the laws regardless of race. It also affected Lincoln's own outlook. In 1864, Lincoln, who before the war had not supported the idea of Black men having the right to vote, he, in 1864, begins to urge the governor of Union-occupied Louisiana to enfranchise black soldiers, particularly soldiers, as being, deserving of getting the right to vote. So we do see this sort of changing his own beliefs as well. So kind of this brings us to the meaning of the war. In 1864, Lincoln said, "We all declare for liberty, but in using the same word, we do not all mean the same thing. To the North, freedom meant for each man to enjoy the product of his labor. To Southern whites, it meant the power to do, quote, as they please with other men, and the product of other men's labor." So the Union's eventual triumph in the war ends up consolidating the Northern understanding of freedom as the national norm. And Lincoln is able to link the Civil War with very deeply held beliefs in Northern society. To him, the American nation embodies this set of universal ideals centering in on political democracy and human liberty. And he summarizes his conception of the war's meaning in November of 1863 in a brief sort of 2-minute speech that he gives at this dedication of this military cemetery at the site of the war's greatest battle, Gettysburg. The Gettysburg Address is considered to be Lincoln's finest speech. It's one of the greatest articulations of American principles ever written. It lasts just a little over 2 minutes, but it is really consolidating this idea of why the war is being fought. And you can read a little bit of it here. So the mobilization of the Union's resources for fighting this very modern war brought into being a new American nation state with greatly expanded powers and responsibilities. The war creates a whole new national self-consciousness, and this is reflected in the increasing use of the word nation in place of the older term union. If you'll note, the word union never appears in the Gettysburg Address, but Lincoln refers to the idea of a nation 5 times. So we are really seeing sort of a new articulation of American ideals. This is probably the only picture that we have that shows Lincoln at the Gettysburg Address, and he's a little hard to find, but you can see he's kind of in the back here. His head is sort of bowed, and this is kind of where he's standing. You can barely see him. So as I mentioned, why now that Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation, formally declaring that ending slavery is the purpose of the war, why was the 13th Amendment necessary? As a presidential decree or proclamation, the emancipation was not secure. It could potentially be reversed by a future president. The proclamation freed people, but it did not destroy the institution of slavery, the legal status of enslaved people, or state laws related to slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation doesn't do any of that. And Lincoln is still pursuing abolition by action at the state level. He issues in December of 1863 a proclamation of amnesty and reconstruction, requiring that Southern states who want to be readmitted to the Union had to adopt new state constitutions abolishing slavery. So he's worried that the Emancipation Proclamation might be challenged constitutionally after the war was over. The Supreme Court at this point is still in the hands of the same very conservative, very pro-Southern, very pro-slavery justices who had rendered the Dred Scott decision. And of course, the only enslaved people who were truly freed by the Emancipation Proclamation are those who come into contact with the Union Army. So you really need to have an amendment passed. So how does the 13th Amendment get passed? Politicians and intellectuals in the North begin to consider what kinds of changes need to be made to the Constitution late in 1863. And among other things that they are talking about at this point is the idea of abolishing slavery. It's abolitionists who really begin to launch a campaign for an amendment abolishing slavery. They are led by a group called the Women's National Loyal National League, and they begin circulating petitions. In February of 1864, they give a petition with 100,000 signatures on it to Charles Sumner, the influential senator. He then introduces an amendment based on the 1791 Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, which is a crucial document from the French Revolution. And this amendment that Sumner introduces says that everywhere within the limits of the United States, all persons are equal before the law, so that no person can hold another as a slave. And it gives Congress the power to make the laws necessary to enforce this. The final wording of the 13th Amendment is based on the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. It says, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist in the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." So this is the first time the word slavery is introduced into the Constitution. And again, it gives Congress the power to make the laws necessary to enforce this. The 13th Amendment, as it was written, recognized that while traditionally the federal government had been considered a threat to personal liberty, the war had shown that actually states are the greatest danger to individual freedom. So it really puts Congress and the federal government in the driver's seat here. The 13th Amendment was the first amendment in the nation's history to actually expand the power of the federal government rather than restrain it. So what we're seeing here with the 13th Amendment, and then as we're going to see after the war, eventually the 14th Amendment, is a whole redefinition of this idea of federalism. The 13th Amendment inspired some opposition in Congress. There was, of course, a lot of racism still, and many argued that Black people were not capable of being freed. They also talked about the 13th Amendment as a threat to the idea of private property, or as an illegal expansion of congressional power. So the initial vote to ratify in the Senate was 33-6, but the House fell short of the necessary 2/3 majority. Lincoln was initially non-committal about the 13th Amendment until he faced a political challenge from the left, who endorsed a proposal not just to abolish slavery, but to add in absolute equality before the law for Black people. So this forced him to take a position in favor of the 13th Amendment as it was currently written. So abolishing slavery, but not saying anything about equality. After Lincoln gets reelected in 1864, he begins to urge the House to pass the amendment. He puts a lot of pressure on reluctant congressmen from the border states to go along with this. Finally, on January 31st, 1865, the House passes the amendment by a vote of 119-56. So there's this huge celebration after the 13th Amendment is passed. Of course, now that it had passed the Congress, the 13th Amendment then has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states, which meant that 27 states needed to ratify it. So they needed to get all the Union states, plus all of the border states, and the 4 Confederate states who had undergone wartime Reconstruction and who now had pro-Union governments. When Lincoln was assassinated in April of 1865, 21 out of the 27 needed had ratified the 13th Amendment. So as the war is drawing to a close, more and more of the Confederacy is coming under Union control, and federal authorities found themselves presiding over a transition from slavery to freedom. So a bunch of debates start to arise over issues like access to land, control of labor, a whole new structure of political power that are going to reverberate in the post-war world. The most famous quote unquote rehearsal for Reconstruction took place on the Sea Islands off the coast of South Carolina. The Union had occupied these islands pretty early on in the war, and when they did so, nearly the entire white population of the islands fled, leaving behind around 10,000 enslaved people. The Navy was the occupying Navy was soon followed by other Northerners coming down. So Army officers, Treasury agents, prospective investors in land, and also a group known as the Gideon's Band, which were a group of black and white reformers and teachers who came to the Sea Islands to try to uplift the freedmen and care for enslaved women and children. A lot of Northerners believe that transitioning from an enslaved system of labor to free labor meant that Black people needed to be able to work for wages in more humane conditions than they had been under slavery. So when the federal government starts to put the land on these islands up for sale, most of the land gets acquired by Northern investors, and they are mostly bent on demonstrating the superiority of the free labor system, and also they want, of course, turn a profit at the same time. By the end of the war, the Sea Islands experiment was widely held to be a success, but it also raised this sort of contentious issue about who's going to own the land, right? Should land ownership be something that accompanies Black freedom? There's a different scenario for Reconstruction that takes place in the West, in the Louisiana and Mississippi Valley. After the capture of the city of Vicksburg, the Union Army establishes regulations for plantation labor. And military authorities there insisted emancipated Black people had to sign labor contracts with plantation owners who took an oath of loyalty to the Union. But unlike before the war, they were actually going to have to pay their laborers wages. They were going to have to provide them with education. They could no longer physically punish them. Families could not be sold off into slavery. Neither side really liked this new system that they put in place. The Black enslaved people or newly freed people, resented having to go back to work for their former white owners, and planters complained that these workers were insubordinate. Occasionally, things did kind of deviate from this model. For example, on the cotton plantations of Jefferson Davis and his brother Joseph, the emancipated Black people on those plantations actually saw the land divided up among themselves. And they set up a system of government that allowed formerly enslaved people to elect their own officials. The future political status of Black people really emerged as the key dividing line in debates about what was going to happen after the war. So in 1863, Lincoln announces a plan. He says it becomes known as the 10% plan. So he offers amnesty and full restoration of rights, including property, except for enslaved people, to any white Southerner who would agree to take an oath of loyalty to the Union and support emancipation. And under this plan, when 10% of the voters had taken that oath, they could then elect a new state government. That new state government would be required to abolish slavery. So under Lincoln's plan, there was no real role for formerly enslaved people to play in shaping this post-slavery order. By the summer of 1864, radical Republicans in Congress had come up with another plan, known as the Wade-Davis bill. So this plan required a majority, not 10%, but a majority of white male Southerners to pledge support for the Union before Reconstruction could begin in any state. It also guaranteed Black people equality under the law, although it did not give them the right to vote. This bill ends up passing Congress, but Lincoln refuses to sign it and he lets it expire. So even though slavery at this point is no more, there's no real agreement as to what social and political system is going to take its place. So this is bringing us to the end of the war. In November of 1864, General Sherman and his army of 60,000 Union troops sets out from Atlanta on this long march to the sea. So he cuts this 60-mile wide swath through the heart of the state of Georgia. Basically, the army is destroying everything in its path. His aim, he wrote, was to, quote, whip the rebels, to humble their pride, to follow them to their innermost recesses and make them fear and dread us. So this is this incredibly destructive campaign, even though very few civilians were actually physically harmed. By January of 1865, he's reached the coast. He's captured the city of Savannah. He then kind of moves into South Carolina and starts wreaking havoc there. Lincoln has been reelected at this point, and in March he gives his second inaugural address, where he calls for reconciliation, quote, with malice toward none, with charity for all, let us bind up the nation's wounds. He also suggests in this address that God had brought the war to punish the entire country, not just the South, for the sin of slavery. He said, yet if God wills it, that it, the war, continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. As was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. So by April, the war has been finally sort of come to a conclusion. April 2nd, 1865, General Grant finally breaks through General Lee's lines at Petersburg, forcing Lee's army to abandon the city and leaving the city of Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, defenseless. The following day, April 3rd, Union soldiers march into the Confederate capital. And on April 9th, Lee surrenders to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. A week later, or just a few days later, on April 14th, while he's attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, the president is shot by a celebrated actor and Southern sympathizer, John Wilkes Booth. Lincoln dies the following morning, and a train carrying the president's body to its final resting place in Illinois sees grieving crowds of Northerners lining the train route. It's estimated that maybe 300,000 people came out in Philadelphia, 500,000 in New York, 200,000 in Chicago, coming to pay their respects to their fallen president. So this is sort of the end of the war. And this week in class, we're going to examine the meaning of the war through photographs, and we're going to look at the aftermath of the war a little bit. So that's kind of the agenda for this coming week. So before coming to class on December 4th, make sure that you've read chapter 14 in your American Yacht text. You want to make sure to complete the reading quiz. It's the final reading quiz. And then read through and look at the photographs in chapter 12 and you're going to the source text. And I will see you guys all on Wednesday.